Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The numbers of those who've been victims of war continues to increase as the battle between Ukraine and Russia rages on. Today is Budget Day, and interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen blasted the Trudeau Liberals for not doing enough to help Canadians. And the totals are in from a Lethbridge business raising funds for the victims of war in Ukraine. We have the details.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Officials in Ukraine are telling locals to get out of the industrial heartland in the east while they still can, as Russian forces regroup for an offensive in the Donbas region. Ukraine's foreign minister has urged NATO members in a meeting in Brussels to send weapons, and more weapons. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is now urging NATO members to send more than just defensive arms. Reporters asked Stoltenberg what kind of weapons specifically.
I think it's important to understand that allies believe it is better often to not be specific exactly about what kind of systems. But rest assured, allies are providing a wide range of different weapon systems, both Soviet-era systems, but also modern equipment. And I think that this distinction between offensive and defensive is a bit strange, because we speak about providing weapons to a country which is defending itself.
Residents in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol are struggling to cope amid the endless shelling and bombings being carried out by Russian troops. Fearing for their own safety, some residents have been living in basements for close to a month now. Most of the residential buildings have been destroyed by bombs. Meanwhile, dozens of body bags containing the remains of civilians killed by Russian occupying forces in the Ukrainian town of Bucha lay in rows on the edge of a cemetery as authorities work to identify the victims of so many atrocities. The mayor of Bucha says there could be now up to 300 victims buried on site since fighting began. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said the State Department would help document any atrocities the Russian military has committed against Ukrainian civilians. Thursday was Budget Day, and interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen says her party wanted to see large tax cuts to help Canadians. Bergen says whether it's an income tax cut, GST, or carbon tax, the government needs to better address the rapidly increasing cost of living. Bergen says Canadians simply cannot afford any more increases in the costs of food, fuel, and housing.
The Prime Minister is ignoring calls for a moderate, responsible budget from people within his own party. He's ignoring Canadians who need real help with the cost of living pressures. He's ignoring our calls for moderate tax relief for Canadians. He repeatedly said no to our request to give Canadians a GST holiday on fuel or cut the carbon tax. Unfortunately, this Prime Minister isn't listening to anyone except the NDP, which is his guarantee of power.
Budget 2022 included more than $31 billion in new spending over the next 5 years, with a main focus on boosting housing supply, supporting businesses, and speeding the flow of goods through our country's supply chains. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says the budget will help Canadians afford more homes. Freeland says it's all about working with various provinces and municipalities to getting it done.
What we need to do as a country is find ways to tear down the barriers to building more homes. And the member correctly points out that many of those barriers are at the municipal level. There are a lot of former city councillors and mayors in this House. They all understand very, very well that what we need to do is find ways to work together with municipalities, with provinces, with territories, to build more of the homes Canadians need. And we will do it, Mr. Speaker. We got early learning and childcare done, and we are committed over the next 10 years to doubling the new housing starts in Canada.
Alberta's newest member of the legislature has officially been sworn in following a by-election victory in Fort McMurray last month. Brian Jean won the seat for the governing UCP on a promise to try and unseat Premier Jason Kenney as leader. Jean says he fully expects a seat at the caucus table. Others who have publicly criticized Kenney, including Medicine Hat MLA Drew Barnes, have been voted out of caucus. Jean, the former Wild Rose Party leader, helped Kenney found the UCP in 2017, but then retired from politics before returning to run in the by-election. 19 former Alberta Conservative lawmakers say they support Premier Jason Kenney's leadership. They warn changing leaders now would mean electoral disaster for the United Conservative Party government. The 19 who signed an open letter in support of Premier Kenney include former PC Cabinet Minister Shirley McClellan, Iris Evans, and Pat Nelson. UCP members are preparing to cast ballots on the fate of Kenney, with the results of the mail-in ballot to be announced on May the 18th. Well, we have an exclusive one-on-one interview with Alberta Premier Jason Kenney coming up in the second half of our program. We chatted with the Premier about a number of hot-button topics, including the upcoming leadership review. Premier Kenney says he's hoping for unity and not division as the party prepares for next year's provincial election.
Well, I think the leadership review is a critical moment, obviously, where we either decide to stay united or to descend into a deep division that I don't think we'd ever get out of. If we were to go into a leadership election right now, with all of the passion and anger over COVID stuff, we would sink ourselves into a endless divisive debate about a pandemic, the worst of which we hope and believe is behind us.
Premier Kenney will also address the doctor shortage in our province and why a number of pastors were arrested during the COVID-19 pandemic. That Q&A is coming up later in our broadcast. Following the release of the new draft curriculum for students in kindergarten through grade 6, the education critic for Alberta's official opposition says the draft is sorely lacking. Sarah Hoffman says the curriculum will not be successful in the end, and the UCP government is setting kids up to fail. Meanwhile, Education Minister Adriana LaGrange defended the draft, saying the UCP is committed to helping students in building a successful education.
I think that it's been widely discredited, and it's further evidence that Albertans can't trust the UCP with public education. If it wasn't so potentially harmful, it would be funny. Like when you think about an 8-year-old learning about Charlemagne, that is ridiculous. But actually, it is highly problematic and damaging because you're not setting kids up for success. You're not actually teaching them foundational knowledge that will help them be ready for higher learning, the world of work.
A new curriculum will set them up on the best path forward success within our classroom and beyond. Our students deserve this new curriculum, and we will deliver. The foundations for a rewarding career and bright future begin early in life, and Alberta's education system is a critical starting point. Our government committed to teaching students essential knowledge to help them develop a strong foundation for future learning, and we committed to improving student performance and outcomes in reading, writing, and mathematics. That's exactly what we are doing with this balanced and measured approach.
The province announced that it is expanding eligibility requirements for a 4th dose of COVID-19 vaccine. Beginning Tuesday, those who are over 70, along with Indigenous people 65 and older, can receive the second booster shot. All seniors and congregate care, regardless of age, can also receive the dose. Health Minister Jason Copping says the number of COVID-19 positive patients in hospital remains stable, but the Omicron subvariant BA2 brings the potential for increased transmission and hospital admissions. A survey on an Alberta town's ban on restaurants serving alcohol wraps up tonight at midnight. The ban in Raymond is as old as the town itself, which is around 120 years. Town official Curtis Pratt says residents are choosing between keeping Raymond dry or allowing the sale of alcohol as long as the restaurant is licensed. He says around 700 of 2,400 eligible voters have responded over the past couple of weeks. Lethbridge police need our help identifying a couple of people in connection with counterfeit bills that were handed out at Park Place Mall on Tuesday. Police reported a woman was seen handing out fake $50 and $100 bills at a business in the mall. The woman was described as Caucasian, in her 20s, with blonde hair, wearing a black jacket. The male, also in his 20s, was seen wearing a red ball cap with a dark hoodie and jeans. If you have any information that can help police with their investigation, call Crime Stoppers right away at 1-800-222-8477. Now here's a follow-up to a story we brought you recently on Bridge City News. Analog Books in Lethbridge held a fundraiser selling U-Gears, which are wooden mechanical models. A total of $3,200 will be sent to the Canada-Ukraine Foundation to assist Ukrainians who are facing hardships as the war with Russia rages on. The owner of the bookstore, Penny Warris, says close to 100 of the U-Gears were sold during the fundraiser.
we can't believe the support. It's been phenomenal. We're super happy with that. And it's kind of almost a double support because the U-Gears are made in Ukraine, so we bought them from there. So there was that support, and then 100% of what people bought went. So it's almost like a pay it forward, double your money sort of fundraiser. So it was extremely successful. We're very happy with the results of it.
Warris says with the success of this fundraiser, they're open to doing more in the future, supporting more worthwhile causes. April 7th was Green Shirt Day, a day in honor of the Logan Boulet effect in support of organ donor awareness across Canada. Boulet was one of the Humboldt Broncos killed in a bus crash 4 years ago. Now, his father, Toby Boulet, and a number of staff at the Plasma Centre in Lethbridge donned their green in honor of Logan, while Toby donated plasma earlier on Thursday. That is so great to see. There was a sit-in at City Hall as many users of the Transit CityLink system attended a standing policy committee meeting about bringing more funding back to the public transit. The city transitioned to the CityLink program last summer, which saw redesigned routing and a cut of around $353,000. Chris Raleigh says the voice of frequent riders needs to be heard.
Council needs to be prepared for that. Like, they've been making these decisions just off the cuff real quick and stuff, and it's not fair because they're not users, and so they're making these decisions without real input, and that's why there's this presentation and sit-in today is to say we want to be heard.
Initial word is that the transit network was also underperforming, again, very similar to Antra. They did recommend significant increases to investment in transit, and those recommendations form the basis for the CityLink network redesign.
The CPC will make the recommendation to City Council. Bird lovers in our community are set for a very special treat. The Helen Schuler Nature Center is featuring a new exhibition with a focus on needle-felted birds. As Micah Quinn explains now, the artist says she hopes this exhibit showcases the beautiful birds that flock to southern Alberta and the species that are most at risk.
People just think that there are just birds in Alberta, but they are not aware that they are birds at risk.
In 2012, Esther Neufeld began working on felting, which involves matting, condensing, and pressing woolen fibers together. She completed all of her own colors and dyeing for the Birds of a Feather exhibition. Neufeld received inspiration for her work from the farm she lives on with her husband Phil, just outside of Pincher Creek, Alberta.
And we have a creek on our farm, and we have a lot of birds that fly over our airspace, and birds that light and nest here in the summertime. That's where I get my inspiration from the outdoors and from our beautiful scenery in the Porcupine Hills.
Neufeld says it took her just over one winter to finish all of the birds on display and a couple of years to completely get the full exhibition together. One of her favorite works from the display is of a hanging pelican.
And the pelican is threatened in Alberta, and it was pretty fun to do the pelican. It's pretty much life size.
Neufeld will also hold a meet and greet at the Helen Schuler Nature Center on April 9th from 12:30 to 1 p.m. to explain her process for felting.
Some of the techniques are just use needle felting, and some of the techniques I use soap and water. It's a cool medium. Kids love it. I often teach in schools, and kids feel like they're such fabulous artists when they work with felt because the colors are so vibrant.
The Birds of a Feather exhibition will be on display in the Community Art Gallery at the Helen Schuler Nature Center until May 17th. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
That was one talented lady. Well, it's a monumental moment for the Medicine Hat College Rattlers cross-country team. They were awarded the CCAA National Championships that will take place in November. Terry Ballard, the manager for sport and wellness at Medicine Hat College, says this is pretty big for the college's program.
It means a tremendous amount. We're actually a brand new program in the ACAC and brand new program in Medicine Hat College. We were accepted into the conference right before the unfortunate pandemic hit. So our first year of our program, we weren't able to do anything. So this year was our first official year, and the student athletes from that program are outstanding. They're terrific student athletes and ambassadors for our school. And we're just so excited about having this program. And then for us to be able to be awarded the national championship speaks very well to everything we've done here to be able to have the confidence of CCAA to put this on.
Well, we enjoyed a beautiful spring-like day here in southwestern Alberta, and it'll feel more like summer on Friday before a cooling trend arrives. Full weather details are on deck. Lots of sunshine and warmth earlier today in Lethbridge as we hit the upper teens. Tonight, it should be mainly clear with a low near 5 degrees. Friday, just a few clouds developing with a balmy high near 21. Cooling off quite a bit on Saturday under a mainly cloudy sky with a high near 8. Sunday, even cooler with a high of only 5 degrees. Monday, overcast with a high of -1. Tuesday, expect light flurries with the mercury dropping to -2. Wednesday, expect lots of sunshine mixed with cloud and a high of +1. Now, the average high for this time of year is 11 degrees and an average low of -3. The highest temperature on this day was 24 degrees, set back in 2005, and the record low was a chilly -16 in 1975. The sun rose at 6:56 and set at 8:11. Let's see how Friday's shaping up across the country now. Expect light showers and 11 degrees in Victoria, BC. Rain and 10 degrees is on tap for Vancouver. It should be mainly sunny and 20 degrees in Calgary on Friday. Overcast and 17 for Edmonton. Sunshine and 11 degrees for Regina. Sunny and 15 for Saskatoon. Expect lots of sunshine and 6 degrees for Winnipeg. Clouds and showers and 10 for Toronto on Friday. Rain and 11 degrees for Ottawa. Cloudy and rainy as well and 7 for Montreal. In Atlantic Canada, there should be rain and 7 at Fredericton. Showers and 6 for Halifax. A good chance of showers at 5 degrees for Charlottetown, and in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect periods of drizzle and a high near +1 on Friday. The federal government tabled a budget today with a main focus on the soaring cost of housing. According to recent reports, the average price of a home in many markets in Canada has doubled since 2015. The budget also includes more than $31 billion in new spending over the next 5 years. Now, the main focus will be increasing the flow of goods through our country's supply chains and boosting housing supply. The fiscal year's deficit climbed from $44.1 to $52.8 billion. The debt is now over $1.2 trillion. The Bank of Canada signaled that it will hike its overnight rate next week by 50 basis points to counter inflation, which is just over 5%. Waterloo, Ontario-based BlackBerry is going to pay $165 million to settle an 8-year-old class action lawsuit alleging it defrauded shareholders by making misleading claims about its BlackBerry 10 smartphones. The company says the allegations are without merit, but that it wants to eliminate the distraction, expense, and risk of continued litigation. The suit alleged BlackBerry made a series of false and misleading statements and omissions that inflated the price of its stock. When it comes to policies that many governments are putting forward to tackle the climate crisis, many are not meeting those targets. That is according to Robert Lyman, who's an energy and environment public policy consultant. Lyman says, if anything, emissions have actually increased over the years.
What is the prospect that the world's governments will be able to agree to a plan to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions? They've been meeting to try to do that since 1990. So it's over 30 years now. And they have set a series of targets, but as a result of over 30 years of experience, the greenhouse gas emissions in the world have increased by 60% over that period of time, not decreased.
Make sure you catch the full interview with energy policy consultant Robert Lyman and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up after business news. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 46 points on the day to finish at 21,834. The Dow was up 87 points to 34,583. The S&P 500 was up 19 points to 4,500, and the Nasdaq was up 8 points to 13,897. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 20 cents to 96.03 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 33 cents to 6.36 US. Gold was down 4 cents to 1931.82 US an ounce, and silver was even on the day at 24.60 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $13.60 per bushel, barley's at $9.69, canola's at $25.35, and corn is at $11.68 per bushel. Live cattle were up 30 cents to $138. Feeder cattle were down 70 cents to $156.40, and lean hogs were up 30 cents to $99.05. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to $79.44 US. Recapping one of our top stories, 19 former Alberta Conservative lawmakers say they support Premier Jason Kenney's leadership. They warn changing leaders now would mean electoral disaster for the United Conservative Party government. The 19 include former PC cabinet ministers who wrote an open letter, including Shirley McClellan, Iris Evans, and Pat Nelson. UCP members are preparing to cast ballots on the fate of Kenney, with the results of the mail-in ballot to be announced on May the 18th. There's an energy and environment public policy consultant who says not many governments have met their targets for reducing global emissions to address climate change. Watch the insightful interview with Robert Lyman and BCN's Jeanette Rocher in just a moment.
Well, the federal government recently laid out its ambitious greenhouse gas emissions plan, which is a sector-by-sector approach for Canada to reach its new climate target of cutting emissions by 40% below the 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Now, our guest today is well-versed in the issues of the economy and the environment. Robert Lyman has spent over 4 decades, mainly for the Canadian federal government, working as an economist, manager, and a consultant. Through his career, Robert worked on a broad range of energy and environment public policy issues, and he's written and presented extensively on the subject. He joins us today from Ottawa. Robert Lyman, welcome to Bridge City News. So great to have you on today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Thank you. Okay, so Robert, there's been an overwhelming amount of information about the environment and the drastic changes some say are needed. So now some, of course, believe that you are the person to speak to about where the economy and environmental policy meet. So I guess we want to first ask you that million-dollar question. In your opinion, in your expert opinion, will sharply reducing Canada's use of hydrocarbons reduce global temperatures by any meaningful amount?
Well, that is absolutely the key question. And to start with the answer, I guess I have to remind people that climate change is a global issue. It concerns the emissions that take place from all the countries in the world, and it affects the world's environment. Canada emits about 1.6% of the greenhouse gas emissions annually emitted. So right off the bat, you see that we're a very, very small part of the emissions issue. But the real question is, to what extent would reducing emissions of greenhouse gases in Canada or eliminating them altogether have any impact on the growth of concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? According to the best estimates available now by Professor Ross McKittrick of Guelph University, if we completely eliminated all of our greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, it would only reduce the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by about 3 parts per million. So that's negligible. There would be no possible way that you could even measure the effect of reducing Canada's emissions in terms of either the greenhouse gas trends or temperatures.
Wow, that's kind of fascinating. So why do you think that governments like Canada continue to pursue this idea then of reducing hydrocarbon?
Well, many people have been convinced, I guess, by what they've seen of the scientific studies that have been done by the United Nations and by the work that's been done through a number of different international conferences, that you can make a difference, if you will. And I won't get into the scientific issues. As you noted, I'm primarily an expert in policy and economics. One of the central issues concerns whether, even if the science that gives rise to concerns were valid, what is the prospect that the world's governments will be able to agree to a plan to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They've been meeting to try to do that since 1990. So it's over 30 years now. And they have set a series of targets, but as a result of over 30 years of experience, the greenhouse gas emissions in the world have increased by 60% over that period of time, not decreased. 2/3 of the world's emissions now come from the developing countries, the countries in Asia predominantly. And those emissions are growing rapidly. By far, most of the emissions that are occurring in the world are occurring as a result of population and economic growth in Asia. So none of the targets that have been set by those international conferences have ever been met. Apart from a few European countries, no country in the world has ever met its greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. People still keep saying that they're committed to these goals, but the reality is that that's not what's happening in the world.
Wow. And of course, we know that for many years now, the Canadian government's been providing subsidies for green energy. So would you say that these subsidies have been a net profit or a loss for the Canadian economy and the taxpayer?
Well, the subsidies is always a very interesting question because many people kind of in principle think of subsidies from government or from taxpayers to industry as a bad thing. The renewable energy industries, which include largely wind and solar energy and biomass energy that's used for power generation, receive, in fact, over 23 different kinds of subsidies or market advantages in Canada from all levels of government. There's so many of these different programs that there isn't even a proper an analysis of them. No one has ever looked at what the costs and benefits are. And it's mostly what we know about is what they cost in terms of the effects on electricity consumers and the effects on the taxpayer. In Ontario, which is the province that has gone the farthest in terms of implementing rate increases and guaranteeing contracts for renewable energy, the cost of these programs is about $4 billion a year, above what they would otherwise have paid. We know a lot more about the subsidies that are being paid to renewable energy projects in the United States because of the work that's been done there. And in the United States, I have some figures here, I'll just quote them for you. The amount that has been devoted is over $375 billion in subsidies to renewable energy in the United States. In fact, renewable energy provides about 4% of US electricity production, but it takes over half of the subsidies that are paid to energy sources of all kinds.
Wow.
And
not a lot of return on investment there when you look at it that way.
No, there's not a lot of return on investment. And so, that's a very significant issue for Canadians in provinces that have not yet seen these subsidies increase, because they will.
Yeah, I'm in southern Alberta, and of course, where I am, we have lots of windmills, right? So can you tell us maybe the long-term net gain or cost of windmills according to their expected lifespan?
Well, the average windmill has a life of about an operating life of about 20 years. There, of course, the most important thing that one needs to know about windmills, as well as solar energy, is that it's an intermittent energy source. That is to say, it only produces energy when the wind is blowing. Typically across Canada, and I'm sure in Alberta as well, the windmills only produce energy somewhere between 30 and 50% of the time. And there are extended periods of time when they're not producing at all because the wind just isn't blowing. the effect of that is that they have to have backup sources of supply for when they're not producing. And typically, it's natural gas-fired generation that is used as backup supply. And what that, in effect, does is means that the utility has to have a double system. It pays for the windmills, and then it has to pay for the natural gas or other backup energy source.
That makes sense.
Over time, especially if we follow the proposals for decarbonization of the Canadian economy, governments will try to eliminate the natural gas backups, and we'll be left reliant on batteries, which are even more expensive. So it's the net effect of windmills and of solar energy has been to increase the insecurity or interruptibility of electricity supply, and in most cases to double the cost.
Isn't that fascinating? Wow. I mean, I know the wind blows a lot in southern Alberta, but you're kind of making it sound like there's an extra cost to that. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about oil and gas production in Canada. So what is, in your opinion, what would be the economic benefit to Canadians from Canadian oil and gas production? It does seem like they're really trying to sort of squash that.
Well, oil and gas is one of the most important resource industries in Canada, if not the most important resource industry in Canada. In 2019, oil and gas produced over $122 billion in export revenues for Canada. It's more important than our exports of automobiles, which tend to get a lot more attention. But it's not just exports. It represents about 5.3% of our gross domestic product as well. And of course, much higher in the case of Alberta. It's in fact, in Alberta, the current estimate of the annual income is about $60 billion from oil and gas. Very, very significant for the revenues to the Alberta government and for the spin-off effects that it has on employment and investment in the province. The average government revenue from oil and gas that comes from taxes and royalties is over $13 billion over the last 5 years, which is an enormous amount. And as you said, governments tend to consider that they can significantly reduce production and do without it, but they have not yet figured out how they're going to replace that enormous amount of revenues.
Yeah. In your opinion, is there any other natural resource that could even come close to providing the same level of economic benefit as oil and gas?
No, well, there isn't. I mean, if you look at the contributions that are made to the resource industries to Canada's economy, oil and gas stands first. The closest one that comes after it is mining, and mining's share is about half that of oil and gas.
Can you maybe quantify the cost to Canadians of the pipelines not being built and having to import all that foreign oil?
Well, that is, of course, one of the really difficult issues, particularly for people who are living in Alberta. The costs that have been associated with the failure to construct additional pipelines come in different forms. They come first, of course, in terms of the foregone investment revenue and the foregone employment that would have been associated with the construction of those pipelines. They also come in terms of the cost of the revenue that would have been earned from the sale of the oil and gas that would have been transported by those pipelines. And finally, because the capacity of the existing pipeline system has not been enough to move Alberta oil and gas to the markets where it's demanded, producers have often had to sell their heavy oil, in particular, at a discount relative to what they would have otherwise gotten. So there's three different kinds of costs. Over the course of the last decade, the largely as a result of actions taken by the federal government at the regulatory level. There have been a number of pipelines that have been canceled. They had, many of them went through 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 years of regulatory review only to be canceled as a result of that. The one that is particularly well known is the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which would have delivered oil to the British Columbia coast and exported it to Asia after that. And then the Northern Gateway Pipeline would have been built for about $8 billion, and that was canceled. The Energy East Pipeline was an oil pipeline that would have gone to the other coast. It would have taken oil from Alberta to the East Coast, and from there it would have been exported either to Atlantic markets, either in the United States or Europe or elsewhere in the world. When that was canceled, there was an $8 billion loss in capital expenditures. And that doesn't include the losses that have occurred as a result of the failure to construct liquefied natural gas terminals on the British Columbia coast. There's been 3 major LNG terminals that have been canceled, largely as a result of a failure to deal with the regulatory constraints or to deal with some of the Aboriginal issues that have been concerned. In terms of the revenue that Canadian oil and gas producers have lost as a result of not having market access.
I was just going to ask you that, because I mean, that 8 billion mark it's a huge number, but then what would that return on investment have been?
Well, it's kind of just the return from the sale alone. It was over the period from 2014 to 2018 alone, the discounts that Alberta producers had to absorb resulted in a loss of $40 billion. I mean, that's you and I can't even imagine what $1 billion looks like.
It's unfathomable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, it's striking and it's tragic, and the reality is that until we start to build more energy infrastructure, we're not going to solve these problems. You made a reference there to the fact that we import oil into Eastern Canada, and that has sometimes given rise to the suggestion that we need to build a pipeline to Eastern Canada to meet those needs. The reason we haven't done that in the past is that the refineries in Eastern Canada are designed and equipped to handle lighter oils than are produced in Alberta. And so it's been much less expensive for them to import them. And frankly, from the perspective of Alberta producers, they get a higher netback on their sales of their oil to the United States because the transportation costs are lower than they would be if they had to sell their oil all the way to the East Coast.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's kind of the fundamental economics that underlie that trade situation.
Wow, I feel like we're only scratching the surface here and we're running out of time. We're going to have you back for a part 2 of this.
Be glad to.
That was Robert Lyman. He spent over 4 decades mainly for the Canadian federal government working as an economist, manager, and consultant.
A big event is coming up April 9th in Red Deer. It's the UCP Leadership Review. Will Premier Jason Kenney remain on as leader of the party, or will Conservative members vote to go in another direction? Now, this is a critical time for the party, considering a provincial election is coming up next year. We're pleased to be joined now by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. Premier Kenney, welcome back to Bridge City News.
It's been too long, Hal. Great to be back. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. Now, Premier Kenney, in the past, former Premiers Ed Stelmach and Alison Redford said they wanted around 77 support from members to continue on as Premier. But you've said, I'm good to go at 50 plus 1%. Why such a low percentage?
Well, what I've actually said, Hal, is that in a democracy, majority is 50% plus 1. But look, I'm happy to be accountable to our members, looking forward to the leadership review. I think that as I get around the province, the vast majority of grassroots Conservatives know that we have to stay united, keep our eye on the ball, which means delivering on our commitments to Albertans and being in fighting form to defeat the NDP at the next election. And I don't think our members want to go into a cycle of endless division. The PCs did that between 2005 and 2015, even during prosperous times, for Albertans with a friendly government in Ottawa, we had a cycle of 4 PC leaders. We ended up with 2 Conservative parties. All of that handed the NDP a majority government in 2015. We can't afford to do that again. And I'm confident that I'll receive a endorsement. Now, obviously, there are some people that are angry about everything related to COVID, who are angry about the need to have public health measures to protect a catastrophe in our hospitals. Some people who are against vaccines, and they want to have their say, and they will. But I think the vast majority of mainstream Conservatives will want stability, continuity, and unity.
So what lessons do you think were really learned during the COVID-19 pandemic? How may have you handled things a little bit differently during the height of the pandemic?
Well, one thing, a key lesson is Alberta needs to increase our healthcare capacity, which is a painful lesson because we have a Cadillac system in terms of cost, but we're not getting the bang for the buck to justify it. We went into COVID with the lowest per capita number of intensive care hospital beds in Canada, with the most expensive healthcare system in the country per capita. That doesn't make sense. So we are investing even more money, nearly $2 billion additional in the baseline healthcare budget to increase by 50 the count of ICU beds. And we have to hold Alberta Health Services accountable for the failure to provide adequate space when we almost ran out of capacity in a couple of times during COVID. But with respect to COVID restrictions themselves, Hal, we can go back and kind of relitigate everything that happened. I'll tell you this, though. On the one hand, we had this huge polarization and a lot of division. On the one hand, you had people who said, let her rip, be like Florida or South Dakota. Well, they had a death rate that was 3 to 4 times higher than us. Others say we should have been in a hard lockdown for the better part of 2 years, like Rachel Notley, with schools, places of worship, businesses closed, with curfews, stay-at-home orders, cops on every street checking people's papers, which is what happened in parts of Australia, New Zealand, sometimes Quebec. I think neither of those extremes made sense. We tried to navigate a middle ground approach based on the best information available to us that would avoid large-scale deaths, prevent a catastrophe in the hospitals, and minimize the damaging effect of restrictions on people's mental, emotional, spiritual, and financial well-being. And I think Albertans rose to the challenge and did that quite well.
Now, sticking with the healthcare theme, Premier, Alberta's had a shortage of doctors for quite some time. My own family doctor left for Holland because he didn't appreciate the restrictions, both from the province and the Trudeau Liberals, that were implemented. He called it forced coercion to get the COVID-19 vaccine. He wasn't happy about it. So what's being done to bring in more doctors, especially for us right here in southwestern Alberta?
Yeah, thank you, Hal. First of all, there actually are more doctors working in the Alberta healthcare system now than ever before. Last year, there was a net addition of 33 physicians. It's true that some did leave, but some always leave. There's always a cycle, particularly when we're so dependent on immigrant doctors. And so we know that there's an acute problem in Lethbridge. You did have in the past 2 or 3 years, I think about 40 family physicians left. And a lot of that was kind of coincidental. There was no particular reason. Now, I think one of the challenges we have is this. A lot of the younger, newer medical graduates are less interested in making a lot of money, to be honest, and more interested in quality of life. And a lot of them want to live in the 2 big cities for more kind of amenities. Then we have very strong financial incentives to serve in the rural areas. We've just put forward $90 million additional dollars for the roughly 800 rural docs in rural communities. But Lethbridge is neither of those. Like Lethbridge doesn't have the same full spectrum amenities of a metropolitan city like Calgary, and it doesn't have the extra pay offered by Alberta Health in smaller communities. So that's something we've got to sort through. Now, Alberta Health Services is working closely with the Lethbridge community. I think they've interviewed something like, if I'm not mistaken, 18 doctors. They've made a bunch of offers. So it will be an addition. I do know in some areas there has been additional service. Lethbridge for a long time had only 1 cardiologist, now has 4. And so we just need to keep building on that, turning the momentum around. With respect to vaccines, look, 99.8% of the 10,000 doctors in Alberta are vaccinated. So I don't think that has been a widespread cause of doctors not practicing here.
There is a grassroots movement called Take Back Alberta. It's a group led by David Parker, who used to be on your campaign team, I believe, back in 2017. And he says he wants you out as leader. Is this just sour grapes? What do you feel really led to this point?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things, Hal. First of all, even at the height of his popularity, Ralph Klein would have 20% of the members voting to review him have a leadership election. So at any time, any leader is going to have some people in a political party who are disenchanted because of whatever. They didn't get the appointment, the job they wanted, or the funding, or there's always some of that. It's a natural part of a party, of a democracy. But what's different now is frankly COVID, and I think there are some people who were on the letter rip side of the debate who were very angry about any public health measures. I understand their frustration. I'm a freedom-loving Alberta conservative. It was painful for me as a leader to conclude at various times that we had to bring in certain measures to prevent total catastrophe in our healthcare system. But Hal, my job is not to pander to one faction of my political party. When you're elected to a position like mine, you have an overarching and very serious responsibility to govern for the common good. And I'm the kind of conservative who believes that radical personal autonomy is not the only political value. I'm a pro-life Christian, and I believe that the sanctity of human life, for me at least, is a central value. That caring for the poor and the vulnerable is an essential Christian and I think Alberta value. And also, as a government that has responsibility for the healthcare system, we could not responsibly allow ourselves to be in a situation where we would be pulling life support on people in intensive care, denying care to others, canceling almost all surgeries, and medevacing critical care patients to Toronto. We were within about 10 days of having to do all of that in September. So Hal, I guess I would say this. There are some people who are frustrated about all of that. I get it. There's also people, and I'll be blunt with you about this. There are people who are, in Alberta, we've always had a hard right on the margins. And even in Ralph Klein and Peter Lougheed's day, they would have one or two marginal right parties that would get 5 to 10% of the vote. The people who are perennially angry, and they have a lot of reasons to be angry over COVID. And some of those are people that we would not let run for us. I screened out about 35 applicants to be Conservative candidates in the last election because of extremism. One of the guys running around at those meetings to which you referred, Mr. Beasley from Brooks, wrote on Facebook that Islam is a death cult and that the Mongols should have snuffed out the Muslims when they had the chance. So we have people with views like that who do not fit into, I'll be blunt with you, Hal, they do not fit into a mainstream Conservative party. And some of them are trying to use this leadership review to destabilize this mainstream party. But I'm not going to give in to that because if this becomes some kind of marginal, hard right party that tolerates intolerance of and hateful views of that nature, then then it does not reflect Alberta views. It certainly doesn't reflect my values, and it would be completely unelectable. So yeah, I am going to defend this as a big tent mainstream party, and I will defend the necessity to have brought in COVID measures to prevent a total humanitarian catastrophe in our hospitals.
Now, Brian Jean, who recently won the by-election of Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche, is back in the fold, and he says he's really gunning for your job. Let me ask you something, Premier Kenney. How soon until you punt Brian Jean out of caucus?
Well, the way our caucus governs caucus conduct, and I think that we acknowledge that between now and the decision of the members in the leadership review vote, there's going to be some different views expressed about leadership and about the future of the party. And I hope people recognize just how accepting I have been of different views within our caucus and within our party. We've been, in fact, the single greatest criticism I get from our members is that I've been too tolerant of that we need to get our act together, be disciplined, united, and focused, and not allow for constant internal divisions and distractions. Now, having said that, we have this leadership review process, but once the members make the decision, I will accept it. If the members say they want to move on and choose a new leader, I will accept that immediately and enthusiastically. And I certainly expect that Mr. Jean and others who want a change of leadership would do the same if there's an endorsement of my leadership. So we'll let the members decide. And then beyond that, I will take an endorsement from the membership as my marching orders to ensure that we get our act together, that we stay united, that we're disciplined, and that we get ready for the next election and stop the sideshows internally. And I think our caucus is of one mind on that.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the United Front. Many would argue that the UCP is somewhat fractured right now. Premier Kenney, what will it really take to unite the United Conservative Party once again leading up to next year's provincial election?
Well, I think the leadership review is a critical moment, obviously, where we either decide to stay united or to descend into a deep division that I don't think we'd ever get out of. If we were to go into a leadership election right now with all of the passion and anger over COVID stuff, we would sink ourselves into a endless divisive debate about a pandemic, the worst of which we hope and believe is behind us. I think that would be incredibly devastating. You know how there is a small number of Albertans who don't believe COVID was real, who believe that there's some kind of conspiracy around the vaccines. These are not the, look, 90% of Albertans are fully vaccinated, 90% of mainstream Albertans. If we turn this party into some kind of a debate over the safety or efficacy of vaccines, 90% of Alberta adults are going to say, who are you folks? Like, what are you smoking? We can't go into that kind of, as I say, kind of marginal, hard right politics, which is radically outside the mainstream of Alberta conservative values and perspectives. And I fear very much that that's where we could end up if we go into a leadership review at this sensitive time, or rather a leadership election at this sensitive time. So that's why my appeal is, look, I've been imperfect as a leader, and I ask people to compare me not to the almighty, but to the alternative. I ask people to look at our record. We got through 3 crises while implementing nearly 90% of our platform commitment, and now leading the country in economic growth, incredible diversification, a balanced budget, a stronger Alberta, standing up for parental responsibility in education, the School Choice Act, the Turn Off the Taps legislation, repealing the carbon tax, suing Trudeau on his No More Pipelines law, holding the referendum on equalization, bringing in direct democracy like recall and initiative. We're getting the job done. Let's not turn ourselves into the 10 years of division Conservatives went through before the election of the NDP.
Now, Premier Kenney, you talked about Christianity earlier in our interview. Edmonton Pastor James Coates, Calgary Pastor Tim Stevens, and Calgary street preacher who's done a lot of good work for the homeless in Calgary, Arthur Pulowski, all spent time behind bars, were arrested. Premier Kenney, why would the province have Christian pastors arrested, even thrown in jail? Did you not think this would upset your base?
Well, law enforcement decisions are not made by politicians in our system, of course, Hal. We have a system of the rule of law. And let me just say this, Alberta was the only province in Canada that did not prohibit congregational worship through public health policy throughout the 2 years of COVID. And every church I go to and every place of worship, people are thanking me for Alberta having been the outlier amongst the 10 provinces in having kept places of worship open all through and having had the least stringent restrictions on places of worship. We have about 10,000 clergy in Alberta, and 10,000 of them did not get in any trouble with law enforcement. 10,000 of them and their communities, Christian and other, obviously made at least some good faith effort to keep their congregants safe from COVID-19. Unfortunately, there were 2 or 3 people who, for whatever reason, went out of their way to make an example of themselves, very publicly and flagrantly refused to cooperate with any of the public health measures, even physical distancing or mask wearing or anything. So those are decisions that they made, and how no pastor, no politician is above the law. You don't get a pass from compliance with the rule of law because you call yourself a pastor or a politician or anything. Now, in terms of, so as I say, 10,000 of the 10,000 clergy in this province didn't have a problem. You'd have to ask those 3 why they chose to conduct themselves in such a way that ultimately judges stepped in and issued specific injunctions on their cases after months of effort by enforcement agencies to seek some minimal cooperation. In the case of Mr. Pulowski, he is, I understand, in the remand center because of his detention for incitement, where he went to a group at Coots, who we now know, some of whom were heavily armed and have been charged. Those individuals have been charged with conspiracy to commit murder. He stood in front of that group and said, "This is our Alamo, and we should be effectively," he said, "we should be prepared to commit violence and die for our convictions." And so, calling yourself a pastor does not exclude you from the laws that prohibit that kind of incitement. So it's up to the courts, not me, not the politicians, but to our independent judiciary to assess the facts. He has every right to defend himself. He is presumed innocent unless he is proven guilty. He gets legal counsel, natural justice, and due process. But no one is exempt from the legal process in our country.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for the great questions, Hal, as always. Look forward to getting back to your program sometime soon.
Thank you so much. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.